Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's free webinar, How to Identify and Resolve a Data Literacy Problem, brought to you by Pluralsight. The amount of data that an organization is collecting and using as part of its daily business operations is growing by leaps and bounds. But is that data being used accurately, appropriately, and responsibly? Data literacy is no longer a skill that can be relegated to a select few data analysts within the department. So today, with the help of our very special international guest, we will talk about how a lack of data literacy can adversely impact a business, how to recognize data literacy pitfalls, and start building a data literate team. Hello to each and every one of you. My name is Shobit Khanna, and I'll be your moderator today. Now, we still have some few people joining us in the back rows. So while they do that, I'll just take you through some housekeeping. Now, please note that we are in listen-only mode. However, we do push you to and encourage you to interact with us today, which you can do so by using the Q&A chat box at the bottom of the Zoom window. We'll do our best to get to your burning questions towards the end of the webinar. And also keep in mind, we will be sending out an exit survey email to you. We would love to get your feedback about today's topic and suggestions for future topics as well. Now that we've all settled in, let me introduce you to our special guest for this afternoon, Stasia Varga. Stasia is an instructor, author, and principal consultant of Data Inspirations. Her career spans more than 30 years with a focus on improving business practices through technology. Since 2000, she has provided consulting and education services for Microsoft's data platform and authored or co-authored many books covering this topic. In addition, Stasia has been a frequent speaker over the years at technology conferences worldwide. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Stasia to the virtual stage. Thank you very much for joining us your evening from the US, Stasia.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Okay, so now that I've said hello and you've seen me, I'm going to stop my video and let you focus on the presentation. All right, so hello everyone, and thanks again for joining me today. Our topic today is how to know when you've got a data literacy problem and what to do about it. So my name again is Stasia Varga, and I have spent many years helping organizations make sense of their data in one way or another. So before we get started, let me just kind of give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to start by describing what business is experiencing with regard to using data these days, and I'll explain how that links to a data literacy problem. And then I'm going to explain what data literacy is and why it matters. And then I'm going to talk about what you should know about this problem and what you can do about it. So before we get into all of that, let's just talk about data in general. Now, I've mentioned that I've been in my career for many years, 30 years to be exact. And that means that I have been exposed to a lot of vendors who are touting their technology and promising their customers all kinds of wonderful things that are going to happen with their data. So I gathered up a few of the buzzwords that I hear, and you've probably heard some or maybe all of these too, starting with data democratization. And that means give the data to everyone. And as I heard once at a roundtable that made a lot of DBAs shudder, somebody said, let the data be free. And that sounds good to some people. Another term, data-driven enterprise. Now that's a worthy goal, but the idea here is that we want to use data and not gut instinct to guide decision-making. But does that mean that we let the machines do all the thinking for us? That's probably not going to work. Does anybody get reminded of Skynet, or do you even know what I mean when I say that? Then we have data socialization, and this just makes me think of about a bunch of databases having a play date. But it's really just another way of describing the concept of sharing data and the tools that we use to share data with everyone in the organization. Then there's data integration. And this phrase is probably less buzzwordy and it's definitely practical, but it can be challenging. And it highlights the fact that often an organization's data is not neatly centralized and not neatly organized for easy consumption. And then last, self-service data. Now, this is the idea that once you democratize the data, people should be able to use it themselves without asking for help from IT. But are people really ready for that? Now, the other thing that I've observed over the years is that our methods for collecting data have improved enormously. The cost of storage is so cheap now compared to what it used to be when I started 30 years ago. And there are lots of applications in use that are spewing out data everywhere. But just because companies are good at collecting data, that does not mean that they've gotten better at understanding that data. And I happen to have data to back up that assertion. Now, there's a company called Accenture. They're one of the big worldwide strategic consulting firms, and they actually did a study 2 years ago that found that only 32% of companies that they surveyed felt that they were getting real value out of their data. And the reasons had to do with corporate culture and process, as well as a lack of trust in how the data is being used. And then the percentage of those surveyed companies able to learn something from their data and do something with it drops to 27%. So all this time and money has been spent for years on making data more accessible to somebody, anybody, and that data is not getting used. So the people at Accenture and also another company called Gartner, who research how this data is getting used, they've identified that a key contributor to this problem is a lack of data literacy. So unless you're working for one of the companies in this group of 27%, your company or organization is very likely to be suffering from a data literacy problem also. But what does it mean to be data literate? Well, the dictionary definition of literacy is the ability to read and write. So in the context of data, that means a data literate person needs to be able to look at data and understand what it means. Just like you can look at markings on a page in a book and understand how markings become letters and letters become words, words become sentences, and these sentences are what convey ideas. So similarly, an understanding of data in aggregate is required to understand a situation within a business context. Not only an understanding of how to read the data compiled by someone else, but also to be able to gather and produce meaningful information from that data as well. And another important characteristic of data literacy is the ability to use and analyze data effectively. It's the ability to think about the why behind the information that data is communicating. And importantly, knowing what the data is not saying and understanding what should happen next and where to look next and when it's time to stop looking at data and time to take action and who else needs to know about it, which requires the ability to communicate with other people about the data and knowing who needs to know what and tailoring the communication properly to the audience if you're the one responsible for presenting data to others, and understanding the questions to ask about data if you're the one that's on the receiving end. Now, Gartner has a much more detailed formal definition of data literacy, describing it as the ability to read and write and communicate data in context. It highlights the need to understand not just the data, but where it's coming from, and what changes have been made to it, or what type of analysis has been used. And the bottom line is understanding what's the point of this data. What good is it? What value does it have? So the point with these two simple and more formal definitions is that data literacy is very comprehensive. But I also don't think that that means that everyone in an organization has to have equivalent levels of data literacy. But at minimum, everyone should be able to read data, just like you'd expect everyone in your organization to be able to read the written word. You expect most people to be able to write, but some people in the organization need to be able to write better than others. Most people need to be able to speak to someone else. Some need to be able to speak in front of a small group, and some need to be able to speak to large audiences or to the outside world, and so on. So different roles within an organization require different levels of literacy. Now, I like this graphic, or this series of graphics that I'm about to show you, as a way to visualize how data literacy helps with the transformation of data into value. Data is the foundation for a series of building blocks. So what is data? Well, it's just bits of information, just the facts. It's measurements of people, places, events, and so on. So for the purposes of our discussion today, data is digital, but it doesn't have to be. Think about the data that you might have encountered this week. If you drive a car, you watch data on a dashboard, such as your current speed or the current level of fuel in the tank. And at work, if you're a software developer, you might be tracking the number of lines of code you produced or the number of bugs that you fixed. Or if you're managing a department, you might be responsible for tracking actual expenses against a budget. So from data, we can derive information. But what makes information different from data? Well, data is a number without context. Information is the combination of data with assumptions about what it means or what standards apply. So for example, if I say 1,000, that number has no meaning in and of itself, but it's a perfectly good piece of data. But if I told you that the unit is Australian dollars, well, that gives you some information. It puts the number into context as a value, but it still doesn't tell you if that's a good number or a bad number. Also, is that number a single measurement, or is it an aggregation of multiple measurements combined into a total? So for our purposes, let's assume that this number 1,000 represents the total purchases of office supplies in a given month. So information enhances the data by providing context. Oops. And that brings us next to knowledge. Knowledge is where you link the information that you have with your experiences or your understanding of the world. It's literally the way that you connect the dots. So if you consider that $1,000 value, the conversion of information into knowledge actually requires more data for comparison. Specifically, you'd want to compare it to budget to know if the spending was about right or if it's too high or too low. Then there's insight, and this is the recognition of a pattern or a connection between disparate data points. So to continue the office supplies example, let's say that the $1,000 is double the normal monthly expense. That came from your knowledge. But the insight is the discovery that there's a connection between this expense and something unusual that happened in the office. And I'll leave it to your imagination what that could be. The important thing is that there's a relationship between two measurements that would not necessarily be obvious without analysis. Wisdom is using the knowledge to take action. Maybe the reason for this anomaly in expenses had intrinsic value that was worth the variance, and maybe it's something that needs to happen periodically, and so the budget is adjusted accordingly. This is how you get value from your data. Wisdom is how you take what you learned from the past to define the achievements in the future. Now, this is an overly simplistic example, but I hope it helps you see how the transition from data to wisdom is supposed to flow. And if you're a data literate organization, you should be able to make this journey from data to wisdom with ease. So, what does it take to be completely fluent in the language of data? Well, there's a company called eLearning Curve who's putting together a certification program for data literacy, which today is not released yet, but they do have a number of resources on their website, including something called a body of knowledge, which is available for free download. And this body of knowledge documents probably the most comprehensive definition of the scope of data literacy topics that I've encountered in my own research. Now, it's not as complete as I think it's intended to be. It's really just the beginning outline. But if you've ever heard of the project management body of knowledge, I think this is the direction where they're going to go, where it's very comprehensive description of the topics, as well as coverage or in-depth information about those topics. But they've broken down these topics into 5 key areas, starting with data and databases. And this group of topics defines the various categories of data, like understanding the different kinds of data available, structured and unstructured data, the difference between raw and transformed data, internal versus public data, metadata, data types, and so on. It also includes knowledge about file formats and spreadsheets and relational and multidimensional databases, as well as NoSQL databases. So that's one area or topic that everyone being data literate should have some understanding of. If you're an office worker, maybe you just need to know that those things exist and that they contain information that's useful to you. But if you're a data engineer, you would actually know the inner workings of those databases and data structures. The next topic is data knowledge and data governance. And this is all about the systems and processes that help find and use the data that you need. It covers a lot of ground, from managing metadata, which, by the way, is like documentation. Everyone knows it's needed, but it's often quite lacking. But this area includes data catalogs, data governance goals and processes, and policies for the responsible use of data. Data resource management is the most technical area, and it gets into things like how data gets stored and consolidated, the technical architectures associated with that, the data transformation processes, sharing data, and the technologies that are used in business intelligence and analytics and data science. Then there's data provisioning, and that involves knowing how to find the right data for the situation and knowing how to evaluate the content and the quality and the trustworthiness of that data. It's the process of exploring and profiling data, cleansing it, and preparing it for analysis. And then there's the analysis itself, which involves understanding different ways to manipulate the data, such as filtering and sorting and grouping, understanding how to use and apply statistics and time series analysis, understanding how to correctly use data visualizations to support analysis, and incorporating data into decision making. Now, as I said earlier, I don't mean to imply that you need to know all of these topics in depth in order to be considered data literate. But at minimum, you should have an awareness of these topics at a high level, and then develop skills in the areas that are deemed necessary to your job role. And the 2 areas that we're going to delve deeper into today are the 2 areas where improving data literacy has the greatest impact for people who are not already data specialists in some way, either on the IT side or on the business side. And those 2 areas are data analysis, and I'll talk a little about data governance as well. So we'll start with data analysis, and specifically the common pitfalls that can occur when data literacy is a problem. First is the knowledge pitfall. People can get their hands on data and dive right in without knowing all the relevant information about that data. Where did it come from? Who gathered it? What does it really represent? So, for example, when I cited the survey results at the beginning of this survey, or this presentation rather, I was very careful to say that the percentages were for surveyed companies and not all companies. So how well does it really reflect reality? None of us really know without surveying all companies, and that's not really likely. On the other hand, the fact that the survey was performed by Accenture and not John Doe Consulting Company, that reassures me that it's a well-conducted survey. Accenture is well respected, and their research is highly regarded. But the point is that the data does not guarantee a reflection of reality. And you always need to keep in mind what your data really represents and what it doesn't. So for example, I had a situation once when I was working on a project relating to ATM data, and I was doing some validation of the data, but the reports that they had given me to match up to weren't lining up with what we were getting out of our new system. So I went on a mission to figure out why. And I had to go through this process of going from person to person to talk to them about How come I couldn't reconcile this data? And it turned out that the data wasn't coming in from the ATMs on a regular basis. See, some remote locations didn't send in data until weeks after the transaction occurred. And it turns out that this was not common knowledge within the organization, which kind of blew my mind. So there was a gap between the data and the reality. So it's important to understand information about your data from many angles. Another potential pitfall can happen during data wrangling. And data wrangling is all the steps that happen after you find data that you want to use to solve a problem. And it can get complicated when you're combining multiple data sets and cleaning it up and transforming it into a shape that's better suited for analysis. So data is often pretty dirty, and you need to know how to look for the signals or clues that that data is dirty, especially when it's unfamiliar data. And when you're trying to merge data together, if you do it incorrectly, you can actually get duplicate values or null values, and it basically messes up your analysis. So there are self-service tools out there that are given to people who are not data professionals, with the idea that, gee, look how easy it is to mash your data together. Who needs IT? You can do this yourself. But the reality is that you can produce bad information if you lack the skills for data wrangling. Then there can be calculation pitfalls. Now, data analysis typically involves some type of calculation, whether you're summing up values into multiple levels, such as week, month, year, or calculating percentage of totals. And it's really important to understand your data and to review the metadata if it's available. So are you accounting for missing values? If you're calculating averages or plotting values in a chart, missing values can make a big difference and might not even show up by default. You could have partial year data, and then you're trying to aggregate into monthly data to look for a seasonal trend. And some months wind up overstated relative to the other months where your partial year is missing values. And you need to know how to handle this. And sometimes data includes not only the breakdown of a total by a category, such as gender or location, but it might even include a total row that gets included. And so now your total, if you try to sum all of those things up, it can be off by a lot. So it's really important to understand what the data contains and what it doesn't contain before you use that information. You need to understand what units are being involved. Are different currencies being used? Are there inventory with different units of measure? Is location data being used with latitude and longitude versus degrees, minutes, and decimal degrees? Shipping dates versus business days? All kinds of things factor into how you compute your data and using proper calculations. And then there's statistics. And this is an area that might be well understood by the data scientists, but it's not typically part of the day-to-day language of the average employee in an organization. So one of the more common pitfalls is the tendency to think that averages imply normal or typical values in a data set. So if I said the average height of a group of people, you'd think that most of the people in that group would be close to the average height. But that's only true with a distribution that's symmetrical. And you need to look at the distribution of data. And if you have no idea what I just said, that's my point, that these are things that we use statistical information without always understanding what we need to know about it. And that's just one example. There are entire books written on how statistics can be used inappropriately. Next, there are pitfalls related to analysis. And this is the process of interpreting the meaning behind the data. And this is something that everyone should be able to do at some level, but there can be pitfalls. And one is the ease with which our tools can extrapolate or forecast a value, predicting what's going to happen next. And well, gosh, I think you over in Australia are still in a lockdown situation, and who predicted that? Another problem with analysis is seeing signals that aren't really there, or missing the important signals. And it's important to know where to look next for validation or where to get deeper insight. And it's also important to know when to stop looking and to start doing something. So you may have heard the term analysis paralysis. So sometimes looking further doesn't help add new information. So that's a potential pitfall. And last, there are plenty of ways to create problems with data visualizations. Data visualization tends to happen after the data acquisition and wrangling and calculation. So it doesn't really matter how good a chart you finally use if your data or the process is fundamentally flawed. But if the data and process is good up to this point, then my personal pet peeve is working with business user tools that have all these features to create these fancy visualizations that really don't communicate the message properly at all. So this is an area where, again, there are lots of books on how visualizations are done wrong and how to do them right. But even if you do pick the right visualization, you have to take care not to cherry pick the data or not to include too much information or so much information that a chart is confusing and the viewer doesn't understand what they're looking at. Ultimately, there should be a reason why a data visualization is prepared for an audience, to help them do a job or to bring awareness about a situation, to know something more about what's happened, point out a trend, illustrate a pattern, show how things are changing. And this requires data literacy on the part of the creator of the visualization to know how to design a chart to meet these goals. But also, the viewer needs a base level of data literacy to be able to see what the creator intends. And a more advanced viewer would be able to use that visualization as a starting point for deeper exploration. So the bottom line here is that working with data is not easy and straightforward. It requires skills. Now, as I mentioned earlier, not everyone needs the same level of skills. You can think of skill levels along a continuum, and that depends on the type of analysis that you need to use in your role. So I'm going to introduce a description of 4 levels of data literacy, and this was developed by Jordan Morrow, who's the head of data design and management skills at Pluralsight. And Jordan is also known as the godfather of data literacy because he was instrumental in the development of one of the world's first data literacy programs. So these are the levels that he came up with. The first level of skills that are needed for descriptive analysis. And this generally means looking at what happened in the past or what is happening now. And this is the results. This is where you have the results of descriptive analysis conveyed with reports and dashboards and KPIs and metrics and so on. So probably pretty familiar to you. An example would be a dashboard that shows current monthly revenue. And a lot of companies are relatively comfortable with this level of analysis because it's the easiest. But this is not taking full advantage of the value of data. Now, just because it's the easiest level to get to does not mean that it's less important. Knowing what's happened before is vital to moving forward to the other levels. So everyone in a company should be involved with descriptive analysis in some way, whether you're a frontline worker or a C-level executive reviewing reports and dashboards, or the data analyst creating that content that others are reviewing. But there are other levels, the next being diagnostic analysis. And this is the process of uncovering the root cause of why things happened in the past. And this is where insight comes into play. Remember the graphic showing the transition from data to wisdom that I introduced earlier? So how does this work in the organization? Well, think about that monthly revenue dashboard that gets produced as descriptive analysis. And let's say the sales manager sees a positive trend happening in a particular location and wants to know why. So a data analyst can dig through the data and see what's selling better, but sometimes the answer is not always in the data. Remember, one of the pitfalls is knowledge. So let's say that the data analyst goes and talks to the local rep and finds out that a particular store has been promoting a new product by encouraging customers to interact with that product, and now sales are climbing in that location. So with this level of analysis, anyone can look at the information and ask questions, but they don't have to be the ones that find the answers. You can lean on the people with the skills to dig into the data, such as the data analysts and the data scientists. to help you get the data. But then communicate with people that have expertise in a process or a market, because they play a role as well. So the human element is very much necessary to diagnostic analysis as much as the data and technology are. Then there's predictive analysis, and this is an area of growth right now with companies that are adding data scientists to their staff, and they're working on big data with machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence. And these skills are definitely more advanced, and it's a big jump to get here from level 1, the descriptive analysis. But you don't have to be a data scientist to be involved in predictive analysis if you've got decent data literacy skills. That is, you've got to understand the terminology and the general processes at a high level, even if you're not the one writing the code. So here's how predictive analysis would apply to the sales revenue situation. So let's say the sales manager wants to leverage the success for product sales that we see in the one location and want to get other locations to do the same thing. So the data science team can build predictive models to quantify what would happen if other stores followed suit, and can show the sales reps how taking action can drive sales in their respective regions. So it's important in this case that the data science team can communicate well with the sales team so that the reps can understand what the predictive models are saying. And it's equally important that the sales team is able to communicate what they know about their markets that could influence how the models are built. And then the fourth level is prescriptive analysis. And this is using data to determine the next steps to take. And this is the most advanced of all the levels. And it doesn't mean that it has to be scary to the non-technical folks in an organization. The technology that supports prescriptive analysis just makes it easier to slog through huge data sets faster, more accurately, and more efficiently than a human being could. But a human being is still needed to bring in the wisdom to make decisions about how to apply the results of prescriptive analysis. For our sales revenue example, this is where over time, the results of making changes to the product promotion are captured in transactions. And then machine learning can be applied to look for trends and patterns and provide advice on where to focus more attention. So again, everyone from executives to sales reps can be involved in the process by understanding how the process works and its capabilities, as well as its limitations, while the data professionals make the process work. Now, just as important as data literacy is, companies need to make sure that data is being used responsibly. And that's where data governance comes in. So let me explain a bit about what data governance is. Data is a strategic asset. It's important to your business, just like money or computers in the server room. So what we need to do to manage this asset is to develop policies that provide high-level guidance for making decisions about how data is managed. For example, you might have a policy that says the organization will maintain a metadata repository for organizational data that contains business rules and glossaries, technical metadata, lineage, reference data, and so on. Then we have standards, and standards are more detailed rules that determine how these policies are implemented. For example, there might be a standard for what a business glossary contains, who maintains it, how often it needs to be updated, who can access it, and so on. And then there are processes, and these are the instructions for implementing the standards. Processes define workflows, the technologies to use, the change management processes as one example. Now, data governance is a pretty big topic, and organizations tend to tackle it in different ways. But if I were to distill it down to some key goals, I would say that first and foremost, the goal of data governance is to take every step possible to ensure that the data in any report or spreadsheet or dashboard is trustworthy, and it is as free of data quality issues as possible. In other words, the data should be complete, accurate, and consistent no matter what. Another important goal of data governance is to actively seek to prevent data silos or duplication of effort or multiple versions of the truth by enabling coordination of data assets across the organization. A good data governance strategy recognizes the importance of data as an asset and makes it possible for people to use it wisely and efficiently as part of the decision-making process. Remember, data is an asset, and using it judiciously is just as important as managing financial resources and people resources. The bottom line is that data that is inaccessible cannot be used to help the business save money or make money. And finally, a data governance strategy concerns itself with ensuring that only authorized people have access to data, and that there are policies and processes in place to protect the integrity of the data and to prevent the data from being seen by unauthorized users. Okay, so that's all fine and good. If you agree that you have a data literacy problem, which many people do, so it's not nothing to be ashamed of, what do you do next? You need to build a data literate team. So we've covered a lot of ground up to this point to explain what data literacy is and why it matters and what you need to think about with regard to data literacy and responsible data usage. But how do you go about improving people's skills? So let's talk about a process. You have to know where you're starting from, and that means you need to assess current skill levels. Now, there are two ways to assess. There's organizationally and individually. Now, there's an organization called the Data Warehouse Institute, and that's an institution that's been around for years. And I remember going to TDWI conferences over 20 years ago, and they've been known for developing something called maturity models. And I noticed this summer, actually, that they published a data literacy maturity model, and they have an online assessment that's intended to determine where your organization lies on a spectrum of maturity levels. And that's also not only where you're at, but also compares you to peer organizations. So they can compare you to organizations of a similar size or revenue levels and so on. So remember, I had mentioned Jordan Morrow has his 4 levels that he sees them as complementary with one type leading to another. With the TDWI data literacy maturity model, there are stages that range from pre-literate to the holy grail, the data-driven enterprise. And it asks you to rate your company along 5 different dimensions. So one dimension is culture and resources. So it might ask for leadership, do you have a chief data officer or somebody in charge of data literacy? Or for culture, they ask, is data being used for strategic, tactical, or operational levels throughout the company? Do people want to learn about data because they know it's important as part of the culture? Are people changing behavior based on their data insights? For funding, are education investments being made? Is there infrastructure funded for data governance? With regard to data infrastructure, is there a data foundation? These are the business processes and major areas that do people understand how that works in general? What's the architecture? Does it support different kinds of users, self-service and data analysts and data scientists? Is there metadata management with data quality and lineage and analysis of how data is being consumed? Is there a data warehouse? Are data silos in existence, or have they been eliminated? Does everyone have access to structured and unstructured data? Is there a unified platform? Is there data governance? Do they only get to the data through IT? Is it just data analysts and data scientists that have access to the data? With regard to skills, is there assessments in place? Are there proficiency goals? Are there assessments or certificates of proficiency? Is there time provided for learning programs? Are people able to build up their skills? Is there a group of people who are in place to support other people and develop their skills within a group, for example? And then with tooling, How are you using your data? Is it locked? Is it available in spreadsheets, or are you using artificial intelligence on the other end of the spectrum? What percentage of people are using things? What are their skill levels? Is are they using data appropriately within their roles? And then with regard to data governance, is the data trusted? Are there policies and tools in place? What kind of security and auditing is in place? So these are the kinds of aspects of looking at data literacy. So you can think of it as, it's very comprehensive. So if you were to go to TDWI, they provide this assessment online, and then they give you your results and show you dimension by dimension how you measure up to other organizations, and it gives you some advice on how you would move from, say, a pre-literate to a basic literacy or advanced literacy, or to a data-driven enterprise stage. So after you take the assessment, you get your scores, and you see how your scores compare to others. There are also a couple of assessments that you can do individually. So there's a couple that I found, one's at My Data Abilities, and also the Data Literacy Project. And the Data Literacy Project, by the way, is the group that Jordan Morrow at Pluralsight helped to develop. But this style of assessment doesn't really scale up to an enterprise level. So, you can go online and test your own, but for you to do it organizational wide, those don't really work very well, but it gives you an idea of what is being considered for data literacy assessments. But I have seen some consulting organizations that offer data literacy assessments in your organization as a service. So however you go about performing the assessment, once you have that will tell you where the strengths are and where the gaps are. And you can use that to make a plan to define what level you want to get to and how you plan to get there. And then execution of the plan is really a matter of providing the right resources, learning tools, coaching programs, discussion groups, project assignments, and whatever else you've defined in the plan. And of course, there should be some incentives built into the plan as well. And then you should measure results so that you can quantify the actions that have been executed according to plan, and you can show that you have achieved some goals. Then you have the ability to evaluate what you've done and turn that into information that you can use to improve your data literacy program. And so this becomes an iterative process. You reassess where you are after making your incremental progress, and you determine the next goal to work towards. So when you focus on improving data literacy and data governance, there are several benefits that are possible. First, everyone has access to better quality content and more trustworthy data, and consequently, they can make better decisions. And in addition, rather than having everyone build out their own content in isolation, when you have a cooperative governed environment, that reduces the duplication of effort, and that means everybody's productivity improves. You have better control over your data assets, and you can ensure that data stays where it belongs, in the hands of authorized users only. And you have better oversight of how your data assets are being used or not being used, and you can intervene where appropriate. So there are a few resources that I think would be helpful if you wanted to learn more. First, there's that data literacy maturity model assessment guide, and that gives some context to the assessment itself, which I've provided this link here. And then the Data Literacy Project has, there's a resource guide, and that has actually several courses, and some of the courses that are available at the Data Literacy Project, some of those are free, some of them are not. But it's useful information. And then the e-learning curve, people that are working on the certification in the body of knowledge, they actually have a resource guide there, and that has links to a variety of online articles that are related to the topics that are found in the body of knowledge. And of course, not listed here is Pluralsight, because we're adding resources all the time as well. So that is the end of my presentation. Hopefully you've learned something or inspired to determine what you need to do next to improve data literacy for yourself or for your team or your organization. And we have some time left over for questions if there are any.
Thank you very much for that, Stacia. That was extremely insightful, especially for someone who's so data illiterate as myself as well. So thank you very much for that. Now we'll wait for a few questions to come through. In that meantime, just a quick reminder to everyone that we will be sending out a recording of today's session along with a copy of the Prezo as well, which you can refer to later on. And if you wish to share with your colleagues as well. And of course, if you want to learn a little bit more about how Pluralsight can help you with not only upskilling your team with data literacy, but also to help identify where they currently are and where you wish to take them, you can reach out to me directly, or you can go onto pluralsight.com to learn a little bit more as well. Now, let's have a look at some questions here. I have a question here, Stacia, just asking how can we get our leaders to really buy into, upskilling our teams for data? I'm guessing it's a little bit of a budget angle here, perhaps.
Yeah, so having leadership buy-in is super important. And the interesting thing that I found in my research was that actually 1 in 3 of one in 3 corporate executives, basically the C-level group, 1 in 3, I have to remember, was it 1 in 3 was comfortable with data? Yeah, 1 in 3 was comfortable with data. That's kind of scary. So it means 2 out of 3 are not comfortable with data. So if our leaders aren't comfortable with data, how is the rest of the organization supposed to be? So how do we get them motivated? They probably don't want to disclose their vulnerability there in some cases. But the problem is, if the organization is not using data, what are you sacrificing? The way I break it down is to do simple things. Your goal is to make money or save money. And if you're not using your data to help you do those things, then you're probably wasting money. Yep. And you got to find some, maybe an effective ways to have kind of like a rogue project where you can prove, here I've done something with data that we can do better. And if more people could use these skills, then think how much better we'd be doing overall.
Absolutely agree with that. I've got a question here from Simon and a few. Excellent presentation. What do you believe is the level of awareness around data literacy in organizations, which is something we were discussing earlier as well, Stacia?
Yeah, I think the awareness is that this is not a term that I've heard until recently. Remember, I'm kind of a word girl. So I pay attention to, the buzzwords and, what all the vendors are saying. I just kind of see these cycles that we go through of, how we talk about data and so forth. And I've been at it for 30 years, so I've had a lot of time to think about it. And data literacy is not a term that I've heard. I mean, the concepts, of course, have been there, but identifying it as, oh, this is a problem that we have, we need to fix it. We don't talk about, literacy being a problem in an organization when it comes to words, but this concept of data literacy is something that I've heard emerge in this past year in particular, and probably because of the work that groups like Accenture and Gartner are doing to raise awareness. So a lot of times that's the organizations that the leaders are paying attention to. I know that Pluralsight has done some outreach to executives with regard to data literacy as well. So it's fairly new, and I think we'll probably keep hearing about it because the problem's pretty pronounced in that it's everywhere. Hopefully that answered the question.
Sorry, I'm speaking and I'm on mute. Apologies. Yes, thank you very much for that. How can we ensure data is used ethically? There have been a few high-profile issues recently. I think James has mentioned the example of robo-debt, where data was used in a way that hurt rather than helped. So how can we ensure that it is used in an ethical manner?
Well, that's a big good question. And so you know, from an organizational point of view, the way that tends to be handled is by giving somebody responsibility at the C level. So a chief data officer, as an example. And, you know, companies need to be transparent about their policies in this regard. So, you know, I don't know in Australia what mechanisms exist, you know, from a public to private. You know, like what I can think of here is, you know, shareholder pressure, you know, news media pressure, but ultimately an organization needs to decide that this is what we need to do, and we need to create representation for responsibility for managing that in the boardroom. So we'll see.
Perfect. And perhaps this answers Nathaniel's question. He was asking, how important is it to have an enterprise-wide data strategy and governance framework as opposed to versus departmental or even at the team level? So perhaps it does have to come from the top down.
Yeah, it's definitely in order for the companies that are successful. So I told you about the 27%, you know, that feel like they are getting value out of their data. So we can learn a lot about, well, how did they get there? And it's definitely because it's coming from the top. It's an enterprise-wide mission rather than department level. Now, I imagine, you know, when you get to the department levels, you get some different autonomy, but the idea is that you drive a strategy, you get agreement from leadership that data management is important to us, and you establish, you know, policies and standards and processes and accountability for managing that properly. And where the data literacy plays into that is, you know, encouraging people to make decisions using data and to create situations where, you know, they have to show the data that they're using and defend the decisions that they're making with data. And but ultimately it does need to be enterprise wide to, you know, see the kind of success that those companies are seeing.
Makes absolute sense. Just taking a point of view from data security and cybersecurity, how important do you think it is to have the team upskilled about and, you know, literate around cybersecurity and data security? Does it depend on the level of data literacy that they're at? Does someone need to have more training around cybersec as compared to somebody else, or?
Well, I would say that there ought to be some sort of, you know, because security of data is so important. I think it's independent of your skill level with data literacy. It's almost as if you cannot have access to data until you can demonstrate that you understand the security policies, because this is a big deal. You know, I mentioned earlier about I was at a roundtable where somebody referred to data democratization as let the data be free, you know, and this was the thing where the DBAs were just horrified. This is probably about, I want to say about 10, 11 years ago, when some self-service tools were becoming more popular. And, you know, it was let the users have the data and just bypass the DBAs altogether. And the DBAs were, just having heart failure about this. But the problem is like, so let's say you're the DBA and say, well, I'm only going to give you data in a PDF because I don't trust you with that data. What is that user going to do? They're going to turn around and put it into an Excel spreadsheet. And then that means they're going to type it in wrong because, people just make mistakes. So, people can be very creative about how they're going to use data, no matter what roadblocks you put in their way, or trying to secure the data. So the only thing, it's a people problem and it's a policy problem, and you just have to make sure that you educate people on the security policies before they're allowed to use the data in the first place. That to me is independent of literacy. And then obviously the scope of their access depends upon their roles and what their skill levels are. But I think it should be mandatory to require an understanding of security first.
Absolutely.
That's just me.
I think it makes sense. Thank you very much. A few nice
data. Let it be free, but secure it.
For sure. I've got a few nice comments for you as well, considering I don't see any further questions there. Simon's just said literacy. So he's just comparing the few terms, right? So literacy versus fluency versus empowerment. Some organizations perhaps don't like to use the word literacy as it can infer or imply illiterate, right? So
sure.
That's interesting comment.
Right.
Shelby is saying, she appreciates how you use your word interest to ensure the right terms are being used. Thank you very much. And just enjoying following your journey on LinkedIn and so forth as well. Let's see if we have perhaps a couple of more questions or a couple of more minutes. Love the presentation. What level of data literacy do you think should be there for a project management team?
Well, in that case, we need, obviously, from a management perspective, like, I could go a lot of different ways there, but, I think you need to be able to consume information and be able to look at things. So project management, I'm going to say project because I'm American, I can't help it. But, I think in terms of managing teams and seeing things getting accomplished and being able to, communicate that those things are getting accomplished or not, whether it's hours spent or lines of code or whatever kind of project that you're managing. But, the ability to consume it at the very least, but obviously to communicate the success or, problem areas within a project is important as well. So, it needs to be descriptive at the very least. If I go to the 4 levels, I would say descriptive for sure. Whether you start getting into, the diagnostic, that could be interesting. I've worked on projects where we tried to see if we could determine what kinds of, or, what the right mix of team would be. I guess it would be a better way to come at it, for certain types of tasks, what the right mix of skill levels to get the most effective outcome would be. So, but that was sort of kind of advanced thinking at the time, and it probably still is, whether we get into predictive sorts of things, I'm not sure that I would see that, but I would say basic literacy, just in terms of descriptive, would be a bare minimum.
Perfect, makes sense. One final question, Vikram. No, I didn't miss your question. I was saving the best for last, so don't worry. He's just saying the way data is interpreted and used nowadays has changed. So, what are the suggestions you keep to keep it safe from hackers and network attacks? Which I guess we did touch on slightly earlier.
Yeah, I was going to say, as I said, I would have some kind of a system that people understood the rules before they were allowed to use it. And obviously, you need to monitor usage as well. And that's part of the data governance part of where what data sources are being accessed when and by whom. and just monitor how that's being used. I mean, it's not only from a security point of view, but also your, IT infrastructure, being able to make sure that, you don't overwhelm a server and so forth. But if we're talking about, from a keep it safe, people are quite clever, is all I can say. So you have to see who's accessing what and keep an eye on things,
Absolutely.
and, accountability and, there's different rules for different industries, so it's hard to give a general comment on that.
Makes complete sense. Perfect. Thank you very much, Stasia. That has been highly interactive. We are past the top of the hour. So let's call it at that point. Apologies if we couldn't get to your questions today. Do feel free to reach out to us directly with questions, and we can try and get back to you. And of course, if you do want any further information around Pluralsight and obviously Stasia's courses on the Pluralsight platform as well, check out the website, pluralsight.com. and follow up from there. And a huge thank you to Stasia for joining us, her evening time from the West Coast. Really do appreciate it. Maybe it's time for a glass of wine or perhaps dinner. And a big thank you to everyone else for joining as well. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you back very soon. Thanks a lot, guys.